Welcome to another edition of the Courage Anatomy tutorial. Today we're going to talk about the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata in Latin is melencephalon, and in Greek is bulbus. We all know that medulla oblongata is a continuation of the spinal cord into the brain stem. I will sketch a diagram, then we can see the boundaries of the medulla oblongata, talk about the external structures of the medulla oblongata, and of course the internal structures of the medulla oblongata. Let's take this as the medulla oblongata. Let's see, this is the continuation of the spinal cord, and superiorly it continues with the pons. This is the medulla oblongata. Inferior boundary is at the first root of the cervical nerve, the emergence. So the emergence of the first root of the cervical nerve, and then we see that this is the margin of the foramen magnum. So we have the margin of the foramen magnum, and here is the decussation of the pyramids. So decussation of pyramids. This forms the inferior boundary of the medulla oblongata. The inferior boundary is formed by the emergence of the first root of the cervical nerve, the margin of the foramen magnum, and the decussation of the pyramids. Now, superior boundary. This is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. This is the pons, and between them we have the groove between the medulla oblongata and the pons. And so we have here as bulbopontine groove, or in Latin sulcus bulbopontinus. And this is the anterior boundary, but posteriorly its boundary is the stria medullaris. Stria medullaris, and that is the posterior boundary. After looking at the boundaries, inferior boundary and superior boundary, let's look at the external structures of the medulla oblongata. External structures of the medulla oblongata. Now, the medulla oblongata is made up of the anterior surface and the posterior surface, or the dorsal and the ventral. This is the ventral part. On the ventral surface of the medulla oblongata, we have a fissure that divides the medulla oblongata into two halves, left and right, and this fissure is called anterior median fissure. anterior median fissure. Then we have another fissure here, and this is called anterior lateral fissure. Then we have another fissure here, and this fissure is called posterior lateral fissure or dorsal lateral fissure. These are the main fissures on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata. We have the anterior median fissure, which divides the medulla oblongata into two halves, left and right. We have the anterior lateral fissure, and we have the posterior or dorsal lateral fissure. Between the anterior median fissure and the anterior lateral fissure, we have a swallowing, and this swallowing is called the pyramid. This pyramid contains the pyramidal fibers of a swallowing here. And so these fibers move and then they decassate. And that is why we said that the inferior boundary of the medulla oblongata was the decassation of the pyramids. Now you can understand why it was the inferior boundary. So at the edge of the medulla oblongata or the inferior border, the pyramidal fibers decassate, cross each other. And this explains why if you have a deformation or a problem at the right side of the brain, it affects the left side and vice versa. Though not all the fibers decassate, but most of the fibers decassate. Well, laterally to this pyramid, we also have another swallowing here, and this is called the olive. The olive. That's the olive. And this is the decassation of pyramid. Decassation of pyramid. Now, on the anterior lateral fissure, we have the root of the hypoglossal nerve. That's cranial nerve 12. And on the dorsal lateral sulcus fissure, we have three roots here. We have the cranial nerve 9, that's glossopharyngeal. We have cranial nerve 10, vagus, and we have cranial nerve 11, accessory. So externally, we have the anterior or ventral part of the medulla oblongata, and externally these are the structures. We have the anterior median fissure, anterior lateral fissure, posterior or dorsal lateral fissure. Between the anterior median and anterior lateral, we have a swallowing, and this is the pyramid containing the pyramidal fibers. Laterally to the pyramids, we have another swallowing called the olive. We have the decassation of the pyramids here, and on the anterior lateral fissure, we have the root of the hypoglossal nerve, and On the posterior lateral fissure, we have the root of the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and the accessory nerve. This is the anterior part of the medulla oblongata. If we go to the posterior part of the medulla oblongata, I'm just going to sketch anything. So sketching anything to represent. Here we have also the posterior median fissure. Aside that, there's also another, and this is the gracilis fasciculus, and then we have the cuneate fasciculus. These are continuation of the fasciculus from the spinal cord, and moving up, they form a swallowing, and these swallowing are called the tubercles. So we have the gracilis tubercle and the cuneate tubercle. These are the important structures on the dorsal surface of the medulla oblongata.